Beneath the heavy canopy of ancient oak trees on Long Island lies a winding stretch of asphalt known as Sweet Hollow Road. Shadows seem to stretch abnormally long here, even in the daylight. Locals whisper that the woods themselves hold a collective memory of tragedy. Once you enter this dark corridor, there is no easy return. The air grows remarkably cold the moment you pass the boundary line into the Melville woods. Sweet Hollow Road is not just an ordinary thoroughfare in New York. It is a legendary artery, pulsating with generations of grief and madness. The dense foliage acts as a natural barrier, trapping the sorrow of the past forever. Drivers traveling alone at night frequently report an overwhelming sense of dread. The towering trees form a suffocating tunnel, blocking out the moonlight and the stars. A strange silence falls over the vehicle as the radio signal mysteriously fades away. You are left alone with the hum of the engine and your own rising panic. Decades ago, this region was far more isolated than it is today. Deep within these woods stood an institution that housed those deemed unfit for society. The Asylum was a bleak fortress of stone and iron bars. Tales of horrible mistreatment and unrecorded deaths leaked into the surrounding towns, fueling local fears and dark rumors. According to the darkest local lore, the asylum burned to the ground during a bitter winter storm. Many patients perished in the flames, while others escaped into the freezing forest. Those who fled were never found by the authorities. Their desperate spirits are said to still wander the woods along Sweet Hollow Road, seeking warmth. The legend of the asylum escapees is just the beginning of the nightmare. The road is also famous for the Northern State Parkway overpass. This hulking concrete bridge casts a massive, unyielding shadow over the narrow street below. It is the focal point for some of the most chilling encounters ever recorded in the area. Teenagers from neighboring towns have dared each other to park beneath the overpass for generations. The ritual requires them to turn off their headlights and put the car in neutral. They wait in total darkness, listening to the wind howling through the concrete pillars. The oppressive silence is eventually broken by an unnatural metallic creaking. Visitors claim that invisible hands will begin to push their vehicle uphill against the pull of gravity. Some say these are the spirits of children who died in a tragic bus accident long ago. They push the cars to prevent other travelers from suffering their gruesome fate. Powdery handprints are often found on the bumpers. The most terrifying apparition tied to the overpass involves a cluster of hanging figures. Startled drivers looking up at the edge of the bridge report, seeing 3 teenagers suspended by the neck. The spectral bodies sway gently in the night breeze as the terrified driver approaches the horrifying vision, simply vanishes into the cold mist. A young woman named Mary is another permanent resident of these haunted woods. Her story is intertwined with a nearby cemetery and a crumbling headstone hidden deep in the brush. Mary was allegedly murdered by a jealous lover who left her body near the road. Her restless soul now roams the asphalt, searching for justice. Some motorists recount seeing a woman in a torn white dress walking aimlessly along the shoulder. If a compassionate driver pulls over to offer her assistance, she slowly turns her head. Her face is pale, and her eyes are hollow voids of endless despair. Before they can speak, she dissolves into the thick gray fog. The phantom police officer is perhaps the most dangerous entity haunting this stretch of road. He appears in the rearview mirror, riding a vintage motorcycle with a single blinding headlight. He pulls speeding cars over to the side of the road in the dead of night. His uniform belongs to an era long since past. When the unsuspecting driver rolls down their window, the officer approaches with heavy, deliberate footsteps. The air turns freezing cold, and the smell of dried blood fills the cabin. As he leans in to ask for identification, the driver realizes the back of his head is missing. The officer then fades away, leaving behind pure terror. Local historians suggest this phantom cop was brutally murdered by a desperate criminal he stopped decades ago. The officer never finished his final patrol and remains trapped in a repetitive loop of duty. He continues to pull over lone drivers, hoping to finally catch his killer. His presence serves as a grim warning to trespassers. Beyond the ghosts, the road itself seems to possess a malevolent will of its own. Sharp curves appear suddenly out of the darkness, catching inexperienced drivers off guard. The narrow lanes force cars dangerously close to the deep ditches and thick ancient trunks. It feels as though the forest is actively trying to claim new victims. A weary paranormal investigator named Elias Vance arrived in Melville to document these bizarre occurrences. Elias was a rational man who carried a worn leather journal and a heavy film camera. He had spent his entire career debunking urban legends across the country. Sweet Hollow Road would prove to be his greatest and most terrifying challenge. Elias parked his sedan near the infamous Overpass, just past the stroke of midnight. He stepped out into the freezing autumn air and adjusted his heavy wool coat. The silence of the woods was absolute and deeply unsettling. He gripped his flashlight tightly and began to walk toward the dark mouth of the concrete bridge structure. The moment Elias stepped beneath the overpass, the temperature plummeted significantly. His breath materialized in thick white plumes before him. The flashlight beam flickered erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. He heard the faint sound of weeping echoing off the damp concrete walls around him. The sorrowful noise seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. He raised his camera and snapped a photograph of the empty space ahead. The brilliant flash illuminated the harsh textures of the bridge pillars for a fraction of a second. In that brief moment of light, he saw something standing at the edge of his vision. It was a tall, gaunt figure, dressed in tattered hospital garments. Elias lowered the camera and peered into the darkness with a racing heart. The weeping sound grew louder and morphed into a frantic, desperate whispering. He could not make out the words, but the tone was filled with pure agony. The asylum legend he had previously dismissed suddenly felt incredibly and dangerously real to him. A cold gust of wind swept through the tunnel, carrying the stench of charred wood and burnt hair. The gaunt figure stepped forward into the dim glow of the struggling flashlight. Its face was horribly disfigured by ancient burns, and its eyes were wide with madness. It reached out a charred, trembling hand toward the investigator. Elias stumbled backward, dropping his leather journal on the freezing, damp asphalt. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like heavy blocks of lead. The burnt figure opened its mouth wide, releasing a silent scream that vibrated in his chest. More figures began to emerge from the shadows, surrounding him on all sides, completely trapping him. These were the lost souls of the asylum fire, trapped in a perpetual state of suffering. Their charred garments clung to skeletal frames, and their hollow eyes fixed upon the terrified man. They moved with a slow, jerky rhythm that defied natural human motion. The whispering swelled into a deafening chorus of agonizing and chaotic noise. Desperation finally broke the paralysis, gripping the trembling paranormal investigator. Elias abandoned his dropped journal and lunged toward his vehicle, parked near the tree line. The spectral figures swiped at his coat as he sprinted past their decaying forms. Their ghostly fingers felt like shards of dry ice, slicing through layers of wool and thick clothing. He reached the sedan and frantically fumbled with his heavy metal keys. The lock turned with a satisfying click, and he threw himself into the driver's seat. He slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily in the dark cabin. The horrific faces of the burnt patients pressed violently against his cold glass windows outside. Elias jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it with all his might. The engine sputtered and died, completely refusing to catch spark. He tried again and again, while the spirits began to rock the heavy vehicle side to side. The horrible chorus of weeping and whispering seeped through the cracks of the car doors. Suddenly, the burnt figures retreated back into the tree line, as if frightened by something worse. The violent rocking stopped, and a dead silence returned to the lonely overpass. Elias stared out the windshield, trying to understand their sudden departure. A solitary light pierced the fog in his rearview mirror, growing steadily brighter and much closer. It was the single blinding headlight of a vintage motorcycle approaching from behind. The phantom police officer had arrived to enforce the laws of the cursed road. The motorcycle pulled up alongside the stalled sedan with a guttural roar. The officer sat completely, still staring straight ahead into the black mouth of the concrete bridge tunnel. The engine of the motorcycle cut out, leaving only the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. The headless officer walked slowly toward the driver's side window of the sedan. Elias sat frozen in sheer terror, unable to look away from the gory stump of the neck. Blood constantly seeped into the collar of the vintage uniform. The officer raised a pale gloved hand and knocked 3 times on the glass. The sound was surprisingly solid and completely physical, despite the spectral nature of the entity. Elias knew he had to roll down the window or face a much worse penalty. His trembling hand slowly cranked the handle, lowering the glass an inch downward. The overwhelming stench of fresh blood and rotting flesh poured into the small opening. A raspy, disembodied voice echoed directly inside the mind of the terrified investigator. The voice commanded him to leave the hollow and never return to these woods. It promised that the next time he trespassed, his soul would join the permanent residents. Before Elias could form a reply, the phantom officer turned and walked back to his motorcycle. He kicked the starter, and the machine roared to life with terrifying volume. The motorcycle sped forward into the overpass tunnel and dissolved entirely into the thick fog. The blinding headlight vanished, leaving Elias completely alone in the suffocating darkness again. The moment the officer disappeared, the engine of the sedan miraculously roared to life on its own. The dashboard lights illuminated the cabin, revealing the pale, terrified face of the investigator. He slammed the gear shift into drive and pressed his foot hard against the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt as he sped forward. Elias raced through the overpass tunnel, desperate to put distance between himself and the nightmare. The shadows clinging to the concrete pillars seemed to stretch out, trying to grab the speeding vehicle. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the center line, refusing to look at the hanging bodies swaying above him near the bridge edge. As he navigated the sharp, winding curves of the road, another figure appeared in the headlights. It was a woman in a torn white dress, walking slowly along the narrow dirt shoulder. Mary turned her head to look at the passing car with her hollow, empty eyes. Elias refused to stop and blew right past her ghostly form. The dense canopy of ancient oak trees finally began to thin out ahead. The familiar streetlights of the neighboring modern suburban town came into clear view. Elias crossed the invisible boundary line, leaving the haunted woods behind him in the dark. The oppressive cold in the car vanished, replaced by the warm air of the heater blowing. He pulled over at a brightly lit gas station, several miles away from the cursed road. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely unbuckle his safety belt. He stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light, and inspected the exterior of his sedan. The dusty bumper was completely covered in tiny powdery handprints from young children. Elias touched one of the small prints and felt a lingering icy chill on the metal. The children had pushed him out of the hollow, just as the urban legends claimed. He realized they were trying to save him from the more malevolent entities lurking near the overpass. The innocent spirits were trapped in a perpetual rescue mission. He looked closely at the side windows and found them smeared with greasy black ash. The frantic hands of the burnt asylum patients had left their permanent mark on the glass. The smell of charred wood faintly lingered in the crisp morning air around the vehicle. He had survived the most terrifying night of his entire existence. When Elias finally returned to his apartment, he locked every door and drew the thick blinds. He developed the single photograph he managed to take beneath the dark overpass structure. The image slowly materialized in the chemical bath, revealing the terrifying truth of his encounter. The gaunt, burning figure was clearly visible, staring directly into the camera lens. His missing leather journal remained behind in the wet grass near the massive concrete pillars. He knew he could never go back to retrieve his notes and personal sketches. The phantom officer had given him a strict warning that he intended to fully obey forever. Sweet Hollow Road had claimed another piece of history for its dark collection. The local police occasionally find abandoned vehicles parked haphazardly beneath the dark overpass bridge. The cars are always empty, with the keys still sitting in the ignition switch. Search parties comb the dense Melville woods, but they never find any trace of the missing drivers. The forest simply swallows them up without leaving a single useful clue behind. Some adventurous teenagers still visit the bridge to test their courage against the terrifying local legends. They turn off their engines and wait for the invisible hands to push them uphill. Most leave with a thrilling story to tell their friends at school the next day. A few, however, encounter things they are never able to speak about. The spirits of the hollow do not discriminate between a casual thrill seeker and a serious investigator. They resent the living for possessing the warmth and freedom they desperately crave in death. The anger of the lost asylum patients festers beneath the roots of the ancient dying trees. It is a rage that grows stronger with every passing decade. Property developers have attempted to clear sections of the surrounding woods to build new suburban homes. Their heavy construction equipment frequently breaks down under highly suspicious and unnatural circumstances. Workers report seeing shadowy figures watching them from the edge of the dark, thick tree line. The development projects are always abandoned before the first foundation is ever poured. Modern paranormal researchers have tried bringing advanced digital equipment to the road to capture audio evidence. Their expensive recording devices pick up a terrifying cacophony of overlapping weeping and frantic whispers. Analyzing the audio reveals distinct voices begging for mercy from unseen cruel tormentors. The recordings are often too disturbing to ever be released to the general public. Sweet Hollow Road remains one of the most actively haunted locations in the entire state. The combination of tragic accidents and historical mistreatment has created a vortex of dark spiritual energy. It serves as a grim monument to the pain and suffering that civilized society attempts to hide. The woods remember what the history books conveniently choose to forget. The phantom police officer continues his endless patrol, searching for the justice he was violently denied. Mary still wanders the dirt shoulder, waiting for a compassionate soul to finally hear her sorrowful truth. The children remain beneath the bridge, endlessly pushing heavy steel machines uphill to save strangers. The burnt patients forever scream into the dark, freezing, lonely night. If you ever find yourself driving across Long Island after the sun completely sets, beware the shortcut. Stick to the busy highways and the brightly illuminated major commercial roads. Do not let your curiosity guide your steering wheel toward the dense thicket of the Melville woods. The shortcut will cost you far more than just your precious travel time. Once you enter the shadow of the overpass, you belong to the spirits of the hollow. They will test your sanity and feed upon your deepest, paralyzing, irrational fears. If the engine dies and the freezing fog rolls in, keep your doors locked tight. Pray that the phantom officer arrives before the burnt, forgotten patients finally reach your windows. Those who escape the dark woods rarely speak of the things they witnessed in the shadows. The trauma lingers like a cold, heavy weight pressing firmly against their fragile human chests forever. Nightmares of rotting faces and shattered headlights plague their sleep for the rest of their natural lives. The hollow never truly lets its surviving, terrified victims go. Sweet Hollow Road waits patiently under the dense canopy of ancient weeping oak trees. The asphalt continues to absorb the endless tragic sorrow of the lost, restless, screaming souls. Do not stop your car beneath the massive, imposing concrete overpass when the moonlight fully fades. The dark history of the woods is always hungry for a brand new chapter.